A sick millionaire asked the nurse to pretend to be his daughter for one day. Minutes later, he was paralyzed when his wife walked into the room with a lawyer and the will. The hospital room on the 20th floor of St. Andrews in New York City was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines surrounding Edward Scott's bed. Outside the large window, the city bustled with life, a stark contrast to the stillness that defined Edward's final days. Once a commanding figure in Chicago's textile industry, Edward was now just a frail shadow of the man who had built an empire with relentless determination. He stared at the ceiling, his mind plagued by memories he wished he could erase. The argument with Penelope played over and over again, each detail etched into his mind like a scar. It had been 7 years since she'd walked out of his life. Slamming the door behind her after declaring she wanted nothing to do with him, he had told himself that she'd come back, that she'd see reason. But the years passed, and with them, his hope of reconciliation had faded. Now, with a terminal diagnosis hanging over him like a dark cloud, Edward realized he had waited too long. All his money, all his power, none of it could bring her back. He had tried reaching out, but Penelope's silence had been deafening. The emptiness of her absence gnawed at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Scott," a soft voice broke through his thoughts. Edward turned his head slowly, his gray eyes meeting the kind, gentle gaze of Brooke Sanders, the nurse assigned to his care. Brooke was in her late 20s, with auburn hair pulled into a neat ponytail and a warm demeanor that seemed to radiate calmness. "You're awfully quiet today," she said, placing a clipboard on the table beside his bed. "Anything on your mind?" Edward hesitated. He wasn't one to share his feelings, especially not with strangers. But there was something about Brooke's presence that disarmed him. She wasn't just another nurse doing her rounds. She cared. He could feel it in the way she lingered, waiting patiently for his reply. "Everything," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "Mostly regrets." Brooke tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful but not intrusive. "Regrets have a way of sticking with us, don't they?" she said gently, pulling up a chair to sit beside him. "But sometimes talking about them can help." Edward studied her for a moment. There was no judgment in her eyes, only genuine compassion. "My daughter," he admitted. "Penelope. I haven't spoken to her in years. She won't even answer my calls." Brooke nodded, not pressing him for more. She knew that grief and guilt were complicated, layered emotions that couldn't be unpacked all at once. "I used to think there was always more time," Edward continued after a moment. "Time to fix things, time to apologize. But now," Brooke reached out and placed her hand lightly over his. "It's never too late," she said softly. "People surprise us, Mr. Scott. Sometimes they're just waiting for us to make the first move." Her words lingered in the air, offering a glimmer of hope that Edward hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For the next few days, Brooke became more than just his nurse. She became a confidant, listening to his stories of building his business, his love for Penelope when she was a little girl, and the mistakes that had driven them apart. Brooke's empathy was a balm to his weary soul, and in her presence, he felt the weight of his regrets ease, if only slightly. One evening, as the golden light of sunset bathed the room in warmth, Edward's thoughts turned to an idea, one that felt absurd, yet strangely comforting. He hesitated, unsure of how to voice it. "Brooke," he said finally, his voice tentative, "I need to ask you something. Something unusual." She paused in the middle of adjusting his IV line, her expression open and curious. "Of course, what is it?" Edward swallowed hard. Would you pretend to be my daughter, just for a day?" His voice broke on the last word, and he looked away, ashamed of the vulnerability in his request. Brooke's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise. She could see how much it cost him to ask, how deeply this longing for connection ran. Her instinct was to say no. It wasn't professional, and it felt risky, but then she saw the desperation in his eyes, the quiet plea of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I don't know if I could ever replace her," Brooke said gently, "but if it would give you some peace, yes, I can do that." Edward let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. "Thank you," he whispered. As the city lights began to twinkle outside the window, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there, a chance to hold on to the one thing money could never buy. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting soft beams onto Edward's weary face. Brooke walked in with her usual gentle demeanor, carrying a tray with his breakfast. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of his unusual request lingering in her mind. "Good morning, Mr. Scott," she said, setting the tray down carefully. "I brought you some scrambled eggs and toast." Edward gave her a tired smile. "Thank you, Brooke." She paused, glancing at his frail frame. He seemed smaller somehow, like the burden of his regrets had diminished him more than his illness ever could. Her fingers curled slightly around the edges of the tray. The previous evening's conversation echoed in her mind, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, Brooke pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down. "About what you asked me last night," she began softly. "I've been thinking about it." Edward's eyes searched her face, a mixture of hope and dread flickering behind them. He didn't want to pressure her. The request was strange. He knew that, but it had come from a place of desperate longing. Brooke's gaze softened. "I'll do it. If it helps you find peace, I'll pretend to be Penelope for a day." Relief washed over Edward's face, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He nodded, his voice trembling. "Thank you, Brooke. I don't know how to explain what this means to me." "You don't have to," she replied gently. "Just tell me how you want it to go." Edward leaned back against the pillows, the weight of years of regret pressing down on him. "I want to remember her the way she used to be," he said quietly, "before everything went wrong, when she still looked at me like I was her hero." Brooke nodded. "We can start whenever you're ready." He swallowed hard, his eyes distant. "Today? Let's do it today." Brooke stood, smoothing out her uniform. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let me take care of a few things and then we'll begin." As she left the room, a strange sense of purpose settled over her. She wasn't just a nurse anymore, for this one day. She was going to help a dying man mend the broken pieces of his heart, and maybe, just maybe, she could give him a moment of peace. An hour later, Brooke returned, dressed in casual clothes instead of her usual scrubs. Her hair was down, the auburn waves framing her face. She looked younger, softer, more like someone's daughter than a hospital nurse. She hesitated at the door, suddenly nervous. Was she doing the right thing? Steeling herself, she knocked gently before stepping inside. Edward's eyes lit up when he saw her, the corners of his mouth lifting into a faint smile. "Hi, Dad," she said, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. Edward's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he saw not Brooke, but Penelope, his little girl with bright eyes and an infectious laugh. The illusion was fragile, but he clung to it desperately. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Brooke walked to his bedside and sat down, trying to channel the warmth and affection she imagined Penelope once showed him. "How are you feeling today?" He chuckled weakly. "Better now." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them filled with unspoken words. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he reached for hers. Brooke let him take her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his frailty. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything." Brooke squeezed his hand, her heart aching for the man in front of her. "It's okay, Dad," she said softly. "We all make mistakes." He shook his head, tears spilling onto his cheeks. "I pushed you away. I let my pride ruin everything, and now I don't have much time left. You're here now," she said, her voice steady. "That's what matters." Edward closed his eyes, the pain of regret etched deep into his features. "I wish I could go back," he murmured. "I wish I could do it all over again." Brooke's heart clenched. She couldn't change the past for him, but maybe she could give him this moment, a sliver of the connection he so desperately craved. "Let's not think about the past," she said softly. "Let's just be here right now." Edward opened his eyes, and for the first time in years, they were filled with a glimmer of peace. "Thank you, Penelope," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this." Brooke smiled through the tightness in her throat. "I love you, Dad." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken emotion. Edward's face crumpled, and he pulled her hand to his chest, holding it there as if afraid she might disappear. "I love you too," he said, his voice barely audible. In that moment, the room felt brighter, the burdens a little lighter. For Edward, it was a chance to heal a wound that had festered for too long. For Brooke, it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could mend the deepest pain. And for a fleeting moment, the past didn't matter. All that mattered was the fragile connection between them. A connection that felt, just for a moment, unbreakable. The afternoon sun filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows on the pale walls. Edward lay back against the pillows, his eyes closed, as if afraid that if he opened them, the illusion would shatter. Brooke sat beside him, her fingers loosely intertwined with his. The silence between them felt fragile but not uncomfortable. Brooke watched him quietly. She could see the lines of regret etched into his face, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. In this moment, she wasn't just playing a role. She was witnessing a man who had built walls around himself, now desperately trying to tear them down before it was too late. Edward's eyelids fluttered open, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Do you remember the cabin by Lake Michigan?" he asked, his voice raspy and distant. Brooke hesitated for a moment, then nodded gently. "Yeah, I do." A soft, sad smile touched his lips. "We used to go there every summer, just you and me. Your mother never cared much for the outdoors. But you loved it." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You'd spend hours trying to catch fireflies." Brooke imagined a younger Penelope, her face lit with joy as she chased the glowing insects through the twilight. The image felt so vivid, she almost believed it herself. "You used to call them little stars," Edward continued, his eyes shining with the memory. "You'd cup them in your hands and hold them out to me, like you were giving me a piece of magic." He paused, his smile fading. "I thought those moments would last forever. I thought I had all the time in the world to watch you grow, to be there for you." Brooke's throat tightened. She could hear the regret in his voice, thick and suffocating. "What happened?" she asked softly. Edward's gaze dropped to his lap, his fingers trembling slightly. "Work happened, the business grew, and with it came more responsibilities, more pressure. I told myself I was doing it for you, for your future. But each late night at the office, each missed recital or birthday, I didn't realize how much it cost us until it was too late." He took a shaky breath. "Then came the argument. You were 17, ready to go off to college, and I wanted you to follow in my footsteps, to take over the company one day. You wanted something different, something I couldn't understand at the time. You said I was trying to control your life, and He paused, his voice breaking. "I told you that if you walked out that door, you shouldn't come back." Brooke's heart ached. The pain in his voice was so raw, so human. She could almost feel Penelope's anguish in that moment, the sting of her father's rejection. "I thought I was teaching you a lesson," Edward whispered, "but I was the one who needed to learn." He turned to Brooke, his eyes pleading. "I don't know how to make it right. I've spent years trying to reach out, but she won't listen. I can't blame her." Brooke swallowed hard, the weight of his confession settling over her. "Maybe she just needs time," she said gently. "Sometimes, the people we hurt need space to heal." Edward nodded, though the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. "I just wish I had more time to give her, to show her that I've changed, that I see now how wrong I was." He looked out the window, the sky now tinged with the soft hues of early evening. "I used to think money could fix anything, but it can't fix a broken heart. It can't give me back the years I lost." Brooke's fingers tightened around his hand. "You're here now. That counts for something." He turned back to her, his gaze searching. "Do you think she could ever forgive me?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. Brooke wished she could give him a definitive answer, but she knew forgiveness was never that simple. "I think forgiveness is hard," she said softly. "But it's possible. If she sees how much you care, how much you regret, maybe she'll give you another chance." Edward's eyes glistened. "I hope so." The room fell into a gentle silence. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the lives unraveling within its walls. But in this small hospital room, time seemed to slow down, offering Edward a sliver of the connection he yearned for. Brooke stood, giving his hand one final squeeze. "I'll be right back," she said. "I just need to check on a few things." He nodded, his gaze softening. "Thank you, Brooke." As she stepped into the hallway, Brooke let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her heart was heavy with the weight of Edward's pain, and she couldn't help but wonder, was there still a chance for him to make things right? She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter Edward had given her the day before. It was addressed to Penelope, the paper slightly crumpled from his trembling hands. She traced her fingers over the name, a surge of determination rising within her. If there was any chance to bridge the gap between Edward and his daughter, she was going to do everything she could to make it happen. The steady rhythm of Edward's breathing filled the hospital room, a fragile peace hanging in the air. He sat propped up on pillows, his gaze distant, the weight of past regrets pressing down on him. The conversation with Brooke had stirred old memories, each one tinged with both warmth and pain. For a brief moment, he felt a sense of relief, like maybe, just maybe, he could still find a way to reconnect with Penelope. But peace, as Edward was learning, was a fleeting thing. The door swung open abruptly, and a sharp voice sliced through the quiet like a knife. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Edward's eyes snapped toward the door, his expression hardening. Patricia Cooper stood in the doorway, her manicured fingers gripping a designer purse. A false smile plastered on her perfectly made-up face. Her icy blue eyes flicked over the room, lingering on Edward with a look of practiced sympathy that failed to mask the calculating gleam beneath. "Patricia," Edward said, his voice flat. "What are you doing here?" Patricia stepped inside, the click of her high heels echoing against the sterile floor. Behind her, Jason Foster, their family lawyer, followed silently. His face was neutral, though his eyes betrayed a hint of discomfort. "Checking on my dear husband, of course," Patricia replied, her smile tight. "You didn't think I'd let you go through this alone, did you?" Edward's jaw clenched. He knew better than to believe her saccharine words. Patricia's concern was as hollow as the marriage they shared, a union built more on convenience than love. Brooke, who had been standing near the window, cleared her throat softly. "I'll give you some privacy, Mr. Scott." Before she could leave, Patricia's eyes landed on her, narrowing slightly. "And who is this?" she asked. Her tone laced with suspicion. Edward's eyes darkened. "This is Brooke, my nurse." Patricia's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, how thoughtful of you to keep him company," she said, the condescension clear in her voice. Brooke met her gaze, unflinching, before giving Edward a brief nod and stepping out of the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and the atmosphere grew tense. Patricia sat in the chair Brooke had just vacated, crossing her legs gracefully. "You look terrible, Edward," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I've been worried sick." "I'm sure you have," Edward replied, his voice dry. He turned his gaze to Jason. "Why are you here?" Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I brought some documents that need your attention, Edward," he said, his voice low. "It's urgent." Edward's stomach twisted. He knew what was coming, and the thought of it made his fingers curl into fists beneath the blankets. "What documents?" Patricia's smile widened. "Just some paperwork to ensure the business continues running smoothly after you're gone." She said the last word delicately, as if savoring it. Edward's breath came a little quicker, his chest tightening. "And by that you mean making sure everything goes to you?" Patricia tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I only want what's best for the company, Edward. You know that. I'm the only one who understands it the way you do." He stared at her, his eyes cold. "You don't care about the company. You care about the money." Her smile faltered for just a second, a crack in her otherwise perfect facade. "Don't be dramatic, darling," she said smoothly. "You know I've always supported you." Jason cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Edward, this New Testament outlines Patricia's role in maintaining the company after your passing. It's just a formality." Edward's eyes bored into Jason. "A formality that leaves her everything." Jason's gaze dropped to the floor, his silence confirming Edward's suspicion. "No," Edward said firmly. "I'm not signing it." Patricia's eyes narrowed, her pleasant mask slipping. "Don't be foolish, Edward. You're running out of time. The business needs stability, and I'm the only one who can provide that." Edward's hands shook, but his voice remained steady. "I'd rather burn it all down than leave it to you." Patricia's lips curled into a sneer. "Is this about Penelope?" she spat, the venom in her voice unmistakable. "She doesn't want anything to do with you, Edward. You're wasting your time and your breath." A wave of pain swept through Edward, but he refused to show it. He stared at Patricia, the realization settling over him like a cold shroud. He had once thought he could fix things with her, that they could make the marriage work. But now, staring into the eyes of the woman who had betrayed every ounce of trust he'd given her, he saw the truth clearly. "You'll never get away with this," Edward said. His voice low and dangerous. Patricia leaned in closer, her eyes glittering. "Watch me." She stood up gracefully, smoothing her skirt. "Think it over, Edward," she said, her voice silkily cold. "I'll be back tomorrow for your signature." Jason followed her out, his shoulders slumped, avoiding Edward's gaze. The door closed softly behind them, but the room felt colder, emptier. Edward leaned back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The walls seemed to close in around him, his vision blurring with anger and frustration. His hands clenched the sheets, the weight of his helplessness pressing down on him. The door opened quietly, and Brooke stepped back inside, her eyes full of concern. "Are you okay?" Edward closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "No," he whispered, "but I need to be." Brooke closed the door softly behind her, the tension from Patricia's visit still lingering in the sterile air of the hospital room. Edward's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, as though the confrontation had drained the last bit of strength he had left. His hands gripped the blanket tightly, knuckles white with suppressed anger and despair. Brooke's heart ached for him. She had seen patients lose battles before, against illness, against regret, against themselves. But Edward's fight was different. He wasn't just facing the inevitable decline of his body. He was fighting to reclaim a part of his soul before it was too late. She took a deep breath and walked over to his bedside. "Mr. Scott," she said gently, "you don't have to do this alone." Edward's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she saw the flicker of defeat in his gaze. "I'm running out of options, Brooke," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Patricia has me cornered. I don't know how to stop her." Brooke pulled the chair closer and sat down, her expression determined. "You told me you wanted to make things right with Penelope," she said. "Maybe now's the time to do it." Edward's eyes glistened, his lips trembling. "She won't answer my calls. I've tried for years." Brooke hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter he'd given her. "You asked me to give this to her," she said, holding it out. "Let me try." He looked at the letter, his eyes filled with hope and fear. "Do you really think she'd come?" "I don't know," Brooke admitted, "but I do know that if you don't try, you'll never find out." Edward's hand shook as he took the letter from her, his fingers tracing the edges of the envelope. "I don't deserve her forgiveness," he murmured, "but I need her to know that I'm sorry, that I love her." Brooke's gaze softened. That's all any of us want to hear from the people we love. He swallowed hard, the weight of his emotions threatening to crush him. "What if she doesn't come?" Brooke met his eyes, her voice firm. "Then you'll know you did everything you could, and that's all anyone can ask for." Edward's fingers tightened around the letter. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice stronger than before. "All right, let's try." Brooke smiled faintly and took the letter back. "I'll find her," she promised. "I'll do whatever it takes." She stood and headed toward the door, her mind already racing with the possibilities. She didn't know Penelope, didn't know where to find her or what she would say when she did, but she knew she had to try. Edward's hope depended on it. As she stepped into the hallway, the cool air hit her face, clearing her thoughts. She leaned against the wall, clutching the letter tightly. Where do I even start? She wondered. The search for Penelope began in the sterile confines of the nurse's station. Brooke scanned Edward's file, looking for any contact information that might lead her to his estranged daughter. A phone number, an address, anything. She found a line marked next of kin with a number that had been disconnected years ago. Her heart sank, but she wasn't ready to give up. "Brooke," came a familiar voice. She turned to see Sarah, one of her fellow nurses, peering over her clipboard. "You okay?" Sarah asked. Concern etched into her features. Brooke hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just trying to help a patient reconnect with his daughter. It's complicated." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You mean Edward Scott, the businessman?" Brooke nodded. Sarah pursed her lips. I think I remember reading something about his daughter a while back. Penelope Scott, right? Didn't she move to Boston to become an artist or something? Brooke's heart skipped a beat. Boston? Sarah shrugged. I think so. There was some article about her opening a small gallery. She didn't want anything to do with the family business. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Brooke's pulse quickened. Thanks, Sarah. That helps a lot. No problem, Sarah said with a smile. Good luck. Brooke stepped away, her mind racing. Boston? It was a start. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she searched for any galleries in Boston associated with Penelope Scott. After a few minutes of scrolling, her eyes landed on a website for the New Dawn Art Collective. There, under the list of resident artists, was a name that made her breath catch. Penelope Scott. Brooke's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. She clicked on the contact page and found an email address and phone number. Without hesitating, she dialed the number, her palms sweating as the line rang. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Then, a voice, soft, hesitant. Hello? Brooke's mouth went dry. Hi, is this Penelope Scott? A pause. Yes, who's asking? Brooke took a deep breath. My name is Brooke Sanders. I'm a nurse at St. Andrew's Hospital in New York. I'm calling about your father, Edward Scott. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Brooke could almost feel Penelope's walls go up, her defenses hardening. I'm not interested, Penelope said. Her voice clipped. Whatever he wants, I don't care. Wait, Brooke pleaded. Please, just listen. He's dying, Penelope. He doesn't have much time left. Another silence, longer this time. He asked me to give you a letter, Brooke continued, her voice softening. He wants you to know how sorry he is, how much he loves you. Penelope's breath hitched. Brooke heard it, a tiny crack in the armor. Please, Brooke whispered. Just come and see him, one last time. The line went quiet again, and Brooke's heart pounded. Finally, Penelope's voice returned, barely audible. I'll think about it. The call ended, leaving Brooke standing in the hallway, the weight of hope and uncertainty pressing on her shoulders. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. Please, let her come. The hospital room felt colder than before. Edward stared at the ceiling, the silence gnawing at him. The conversation with Brooke about Penelope had left a fragile thread of hope in his heart. But hope was a dangerous thing. It was so easy to lose. A soft knock at the door startled him. He turned his head slowly, expecting to see Brooke. Instead, Jason Foster stepped in, his face lined with worry. Edward, Jason said, closing the door gently behind him. His voice was low, cautious. Can we talk? Edward sighed, his eyes narrowing. I think we've said enough. Jason. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his fingers clutching his briefcase. I know how it looked with Patricia earlier, but there are things you need to know. Edward's jaw tightened. Like what? That my wife has been planning to rob me blind while I lie here dying. Jason flinched. I didn't know how deep it went until recently. Patricia's been covering her tracks well, but I found something. Edward, something you need to see. He set his briefcase on the small table beside Edward's bed, flicking the latches open. He pulled out a folder thick with papers and laid it in Edward's trembling hands. Edward flipped it open, his eyes scanning the documents. Bank statements, wire transfers, emails, the numbers blurred together. But one thing was clear. Patricia had been funneling money out of his company for years. The accounts were overseas, under names Edward didn't recognize. She's been siphoning funds slowly, Jason explained, his voice tight. Just enough not to raise suspicion. But recently, she started moving larger sums. I think she knows the end is near and wants to make her final move before you're gone. Edward's hands clenched the papers, his knuckles white. Anger bubbled in his chest, burning away the exhaustion for a moment. How long have you known this? Not long, Jason admitted. I was blind to it, just like you. Patricia was good at hiding her tracks. But once I started digging, everything unraveled. Edward closed the folder, his shoulders slumping. She's counting on me being too weak to fight back. Jason nodded. And if you sign that testament she's pushing for, she'll have everything, the company, your assets, everything you built. Edward's eyes hardened. She won't get it. I won't let her. Jason hesitated. What do you want to do? Edward stared at the documents, his mind racing. He felt the weight of his life. But more than that, he felt the sting of betrayal. He had given Patricia trust, security, a life most people only dreamed of, and she had turned it into poison. "I want to stop her," he said, his voice firm. "But I don't have much time. I need to make sure Penelope knows the truth. She deserves to know everything." Jason nodded. "I'll help you in any way I can. But Edward, there's something else." Edward's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Jason hesitated, glancing at the door as if to make sure they were truly alone. "I've been digging through the company's records, and Patricia isn't working alone." A chill ran through Edward. "Who else?" Jason took a deep breath. "There's a connection to someone on the board. I haven't identified who yet, but they're helping her cover the money trail. That's how she's been able to hide it for so long." Edward's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. He felt like the walls were closing in. Betrayal on all sides, the company he'd built being dismantled piece by people he had trusted. "She thinks she's untouchable," Edward said quietly. "But she's wrong." Jason leaned forward, his voice urgent. "We need to act fast. If Penelope agrees to see you, maybe she can help. She's still legally your next of kin. If we can get her on our side, we can block Patricia's moves." Edward's heart twisted. The thought of seeing Penelope again filled him with both hope and fear. What if she refused? What if she walked away and never looked back? But he knew he didn't have the luxury of doubt anymore. Time was slipping away, and if he didn't act now, everything he cared about would be lost. "Jason," Edward said, his voice steely, "do whatever you need to do. I'll talk to Penelope. I have to make her understand." Jason nodded, his face grim. "I'll start preparing the paperwork. We're going to need everything in place to counter Patricia's claims." He closed the briefcase and stood up. "I'll be back later. Rest if you can." Edward watched Jason leave, his mind a storm of thoughts, the betrayal, the impending loss of his company, the chance, however slim, of making things right with Penelope. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but beneath it was a core of steel. He wasn't done fighting. The door opened again, and this time it was Brooke. Her expression was cautious, hope flickering behind her eyes. "I talked to Penelope," she said softly. Edward's breath caught, and Brooke hesitated, then gave a small nod. "She said she'd think about it." A tear slipped down Edward's cheek, the fragile thread of hope tightening in his chest. "That's more than I deserve." "It's a start," Brooke said, sitting down beside him. "Don't give up on her yet." He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't." The battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, Edward felt like he had a chance to fight, to redeem himself, and to protect the things that truly mattered. Edward lay back against the pillows, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The weight of Jason's revelations pressed heavily on his chest, each breath feeling like a laborious task. Betrayal, deceit, the threads of his life's work were unraveling, and the hands pulling at those threads belonged to people he had trusted. And yet, through the dense fog of despair, a small flame of hope flickered. Penelope knew. Brooke had reached her, and even if all she'd promised was to think about it, it was more than he'd had in years. The fragile possibility of reconciliation kept him tethered to the present. The door creaked open, and Brooke stepped inside, her eyes gentle yet cautious. She carried a cup of tea, steam curling from its surface. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing it on the small table beside his bed. Edward offered a weak smile. "You're always looking out for me." "It's my job," she replied softly. "But it feels like more than that now." Edward nodded, his throat tightening. "Did you hear back from Penelope?" Brooke shook her head. "Not yet, but she's thinking about it. That's a lot more than most people would do." He let out a shaky breath. "I suppose you're right." Brooke hesitated, then sat down in the chair next to his bed. "I know it feels like everything is falling apart," she said, her voice steady. "But you're not alone in this, Edward. We'll figure it out, one step at a time." He closed his eyes, her words a small comfort. For so long, he'd felt like he was walking this path alone. But now, he realized he had someone by his side, someone who genuinely cared. The silence was broken by the sudden vibration of Brooke's phone. She pulled it from her pocket and glanced at the screen. Her eyes widened slightly. "It's Penelope," she whispered. Edward's heart lurched painfully. His hands clenched the blanket, his knuckles turning white. "Put it on speaker," he rasped. Brooke nodded and pressed the button, her voice calm despite the tension in the room. "Penelope, it's Brooke." A moment of static, and then Penelope's voice, hesitant and soft, came through the speaker. "Hi, Brooke. I've been thinking." Edward's eyes glistened with tears. He could barely breathe, afraid that any sound might break the fragile moment. "I'm in New York," Penelope continued. "I got in this morning. I'm still not sure about this, but I need to know if it's real, if he really means it." Edward's breath came in shallow gasps. He opened his mouth, his voice shaking. "Penelope, it's me. It's your dad." A long pause. Edward's heart felt like it might shatter under the weight of the silence. Then, Penelope spoke, her voice trembling. "I'm at the cafe across the street. I don't know if I can come inside yet." Edward closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. "That's okay," he whispered. "I'll wait for you. Take your time." "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. I just need a minute." The call ended, and the silence in the room felt heavy with anticipation. Edward turned to Brooke, his eyes brimming with a mixture of fear and hope. "She's here," he said, his voice breaking. "She's really here." Brooke squeezed his hand gently. "She's scared, Edward. But she came. That means something." Edward nodded, his breath shaky. "I just need her to know how sorry I am, how much I love her." "Then tell her," Brooke said softly. "She needs to hear it from you." The minutes felt like hours. Edward's mind raced with memories of Penelope, the way she used to laugh, the sparkle in her eyes when she showed him her latest drawing, the way she had looked at him that last time before she walked out of his life. He had replayed that moment in his head 1,000 times, wishing he could take back his harsh words. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. The door creaked open slowly, and Penelope stepped inside. Edward's breath caught in his throat. She was older, of course, her face more defined, her eyes shadowed with experiences he hadn't been there to witness. Her hair, once long and wild, was now shoulder-length, tucked neatly behind her ears. She wore a simple gray coat, her hands clutching the strap of her purse tightly. She didn't move further into the room, as if an invisible barrier kept her at the threshold. Her eyes met his, a storm of emotions swirling within them. Hurt, anger, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite place. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. Tears welled in Edward's eyes. "Hi, sweetheart." Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of years lost. Edward struggled to find the right words, his throat tight. "I'm sorry," he finally choked out. "For everything. For pushing you away. For not listening when you needed me most." Penelope's jaw clenched, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Why now, Dad? Why did it take this for you to see me?" His chest constricted painfully. "Because I was a fool," he whispered. "A stubborn, prideful fool who thought he had all the time in the world. And now that I don't, I realize how much I've lost." A tear slid down Penelope's cheek. "You hurt me," she said softly. "You made me feel like I didn't matter." Edward's heart shattered. "You mattered more than anything," he said, his voice breaking. "I just didn't know how to show it." She took a shaky breath, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Edward nodded, his own tears falling freely now. "I understand, but I need you to know that I love you, more than anything, and I'm so sorry." The room was silent, the air thick with pain and unspoken words. Then, slowly, Penelope took a step forward. Edward's breath hitched. He opened his arms, his whole body trembling. She hesitated for a moment, then closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms around him. Edward's body shook with sobs as he held her close, his tears soaking into her hair. For the first time in years, Edward felt whole. The pieces of his broken heart began to mend, bound together by the fragile thread of hope. Edward clung to Penelope, his frail body trembling with sobs. Years of regret poured out of him, each tear carrying the weight of words left unsaid and moments missed. He pressed his cheek against her hair, the familiar scent of lavender shampoo stirring memories he thought he'd lost forever. Penelope's arms wrapped around him hesitantly at first. Then, with more strength, as if testing the boundaries of this fragile reunion. She could feel the frailty in his frame, the bones beneath his thinning skin. It struck her how much he had aged since the last time she'd seen him. The powerful, unyielding man she had walked away from was gone, replaced by someone who seemed almost broken. Finally, she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Edward's eyes were red and glistening, his cheeks wet. He looked at her like a man seeing sunlight after years in darkness. "I didn't think you'd come," he whispered, his voice raw. Penelope's gaze wavered. "I didn't think I would either," she admitted. "But I needed to know if you were sincere." He swallowed hard, nodding. "I am, Penelope. I've never been more sincere about anything in my life." She glanced at Brooke, who was standing by the window, giving them space while still offering silent support. Then her eyes returned to Edward, scanning his face for answers. "Why now, Dad? Why couldn't you say these things before?" Edward's eyes dropped to his lap, shame etched into every line of his face. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of admitting I was wrong. Afraid of losing control, I thought. If I kept pushing forward, if I stayed focused on the business, I could fix everything." He looked back at her, his voice trembling. "But all I did was push you away." Penelope nodded slowly. "You did." Silence stretched between them, raw and open. Edward's chest ached, but he knew this was the moment of truth. He had to face the full weight of his mistakes. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said softly, "but I want to make things right, even if it's just with the time I have left." Penelope's eyes filled with tears again. "I spent so long being angry at you," she whispered. "I thought if I stayed away, I could protect myself from being hurt again, but all it did was make me feel more alone." Edward reached out, his hand trembling. "I never wanted you to feel that way. You deserved better." She hesitated, then took his hand, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "I just want to understand why you couldn't see me, really see me, before it got to this point." He squeezed her hand gently. "Because I was blinded by my own pride, and now that the end is near, all those things that seemed important, they don't matter anymore. All that matters is you." A tear slipped down Penelope's cheek. "I don't know if I can forgive you completely," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." Edward's breath hitched, a wave of relief washing over him. "That's all I can ask for." Brooke shifted slightly, drawing Penelope's attention. "There's something else you should know," Brooke said softly, glancing at Edward for permission. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's about Patricia." Penelope's brows furrowed. "Patricia? What about her?" Edward took a shaky breath, his eyes hardening. "She's been stealing from the company, embezzling money, covering her tracks. Jason found the evidence. She's planning to take everything once I'm gone." Penelope's eyes widened, disbelief and anger flashing across her face. "And you let her stay this long?" "I didn't know," Edward said, his voice strained. "Not until recently. I thought she cared, even if just a little. But I was wrong. I was blind." Penelope's jaw clenched. "So she's been waiting for you to die so she can take over everything?" Edward nodded. "Yes, but I won't let her." A steely resolve settled over Penelope's face. "Neither will I." Edward's heart swelled with a strange mixture of pride and sadness. His daughter had grown into a strong, determined woman, qualities he admired and regretted not nurturing. "We need to stop her," Edward said. "Jason's working on it, but if she finds out we know, she'll move faster." Penelope took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Then we need to be smarter. You said Jason has evidence." Edward nodded. "Enough to expose her, but we need to act quickly." Penelope turned to Brooke. "Can you help us?" Brooke nodded firmly. "Absolutely, whatever you need." Penelope's gaze softened. "Thank you for everything." Brooke smiled gently. "You don't have to thank me. I just want to see things set right." Edward squeezed Penelope's hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We'll do this together," he said. "I'm not letting her win." Penelope nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Neither am I," as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden hue through the window. Edward felt a sense of purpose return to him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just waiting to die. He was fighting for something, someone, who mattered more than all the money and power he'd ever had. He looked at his daughter, the strength in her gaze, and knew that no matter what happened next, they were finally on the same side. And that, he realized, was worth everything. The golden hues of the sunset faded into twilight, casting long shadows across Edward's hospital room. The city outside buzzed with life. Oblivious to the storm brewing within these walls, Edward leaned back against his pillows, exhaustion etched deep into his face. But there was a flicker of resolve in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Penelope sat beside him, her fingers still wrapped around his hand. The anger that had simmered within her for years had shifted into a quiet determination. She was here now, and she wouldn't let Patricia tear down what was left of her father's legacy. Brooke stood near the window, her gaze thoughtful as she watched the city lights blink to life. "Jason said he's preparing the paperwork to block Patricia's moves," she said. "But we need to act fast if she suspects anything. She'll disappear with the money." Penelope's jaw clenched. "She won't get away with it. We need to confront her, but we have to be smart about it." Edward nodded, his breath shallow but steady. "I want her to know she can't win. Not this time." A knock at the door interrupted them. Brooke exchanged a wary glance with Penelope before opening it. Jason stepped inside, his face tense, a leather briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. "We have a problem," Jason said, his voice low. Edward's fingers curled into the blanket. "What now?" Jason exhaled sharply. "Patricia's getting suspicious. I think she knows we're onto her. She's already made arrangements to transfer the remaining funds offshore. If we don't stop her tonight, she'll drain the accounts." Edward's face tightened, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "We can't let that happen." "We won't," Penelope said firmly. She turned to Jason. "How do we stop her?" Jason hesitated, glancing between Edward and Penelope. "We need her to confess. If we can get her to admit what she's done, we can lock her out of the accounts and take legal action. But that means confronting her directly." Edward's breath hitched. "Here, in the hospital." Jason nodded. "It might be the only chance we have." Penelope's eyes darkened. "Then let's do it." An hour later, the atmosphere in Edward's room was tense. Every breath waited with anticipation. Edward sat propped up in his bed, his face pale but determined. Penelope stood by his side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Brooke and Jason positioned themselves near the door, ready to step in if things went south. A sharp knock broke the silence, and before anyone could respond, the door swung open. Patricia strode in, her heels clicking against the tile floor, her face a mask of cold confidence. Her eyes swept the room, narrowing slightly when she saw Penelope. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "I didn't realize we were having a family reunion." Penelope's gaze was steely. "Cut the act, Patricia." Patricia's smile faltered for just a second, a crack in her polished veneer. "I don't know what you're talking about." Edward's voice was low and strained. "We know everything, Patricia. The embezzlement, the offshore accounts, the betrayal. It's over." Patricia's eyes flicked to Jason, then to Brooke, calculating her next move. "Is this some kind of joke? You're sick, Edward. You don't know what you're saying." Jason stepped forward, holding up the folder of documents. "We have proof, Patricia. Bank records. Emails. Enough to put you away for a long time." Her face paled, but she recovered quickly, her lips curling into a sneer. "You think you can pin this on me?" Edward signed off on everything. He's the one who mismanaged the company. "I was just trying to save it." Edward's hands shook with rage. "Save it? You were bleeding it dry. You were waiting for me to die so you could take everything." Patricia's eyes flashed, her mask slipping further. "You were already dying, Edward. You were a fool to think you could hold on to everything forever. I was the only one smart enough to protect what was left." Penelope took a step forward, her voice cold. "You don't care about the company. You care about the money, and you were willing to destroy everything my father built just to line your pockets." Patricia's eyes met Penelope's, hatred burning in her gaze. "You're just like him. Naive, sentimental. Neither of you deserves any of it." Edward's breath came in ragged gasps, his face contorted with pain. "You won't get away with this." Patricia laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Who's going to stop me, you?" She gestured to Edward's frail body. "You can barely breathe. And your daughter? She's been gone for years. No one will believe either of you." Jason's voice was steady. "They'll believe the evidence, and they'll believe the recording." Patricia froze, her eyes widening. "What recording?" Brooke held up her phone, the screen still glowing. "This one," she said calmly. "Every word you just said was recorded." Patricia's face drained of color, her confidence crumbling. "You can't—" "It's done," Edward said, his voice firm despite his trembling hands. "It's over, Patricia." She took a step back, her eyes wild, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "No," Penelope said, her voice like steel. "The only regret here is trusting you." Patricia's shoulders slumped, defeat washing over her face. Jason moved toward the door, signaling for the security guards who had been waiting just outside. They stepped in, their presence a silent confirmation that Patricia's game was finally over. As they led her away, she shot one last venomous glare at Edward. "This isn't the end." Edward closed his eyes, his breath shaky. "For me, it is." The door closed behind her, the room falling into an exhausted silence. Edward's shoulders sagged, the weight of years of betrayal finally lifting. He turned to Penelope, his eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. Penelope's eyes shone with tears, but she took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We did it, Dad. Together." Edward nodded, a faint smile trembling on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of peace. The door clicked shut behind Patricia, her venomous glare lingering in Edward's mind. The echoes of her departure seemed to dissipate, leaving a heavy stillness in the hospital room. Edward slumped back into the pillows, his body trembling from the effort of the confrontation. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, but his eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Penelope sat beside him, her fingers intertwined with his, her grip firm and steady. There was strength in her touch, a silent reassurance that she was there, that the weight of his burdens no longer rested on his shoulders alone. Jason exhaled deeply, breaking the silence. "It's done," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've already notified the authorities and locked Patricia out of all accounts. She can't touch another cent." Edward's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, his chest rising and falling slowly. When he opened them, a faint smile flickered across his lips. "Thank you, Jason, for everything." Jason nodded, his expression softening. "It's not over yet, Edward. We still need to finalize the New Testament. You need to decide what happens to the company." Edward's gaze shifted to Penelope. Searching her face for answers he wasn't sure he could provide. He had spent his entire life building his empire, sacrificing everything, including his relationship with his daughter, for it. But now, standing at the threshold of his own mortality, he saw the truth clearly. The company was just bricks, mortar, and paper. His real legacy lay in the relationships he'd neglected for too long. Penelope met his eyes, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. "Dad, I don't know if I'm the right person to take over the company," she admitted. "It's not the life I wanted. It's not who I am." Edward nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "I know, and I won't ask you to become someone you're not, but I want you to know that it's yours. If you want it, you have the strength, the intelligence, everything I never told you that you had." Her eyes shimmered with tears, her fingers tightening around his hand. "What if I fail?" He shook his head gently. "You won't, and even if you stumble, that's okay. Failure isn't the end. It's just another step forward." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't want to lose myself in it like you did." Edward's smile was bittersweet. "Then don't. Make it something new, something that reflects who you are. Don't let it consume you the way I let it consume me." Penelope nodded, the knot in her chest loosening just a little. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." Jason cleared his throat gently. "We can also designate someone to help oversee things. A trustee, perhaps. Someone who can ensure the company's stability while giving Penelope time to decide her path." Edward's eyes drifted to Brooke, who had been standing quietly by the window, a soft smile on her face. "What about you, Brooke?" he asked, his voice tentative. "Would you consider being part of that? Helping make sure the company supports people who really need it?" Brooke's eyes widened. "Me? I don't know anything about running a business." Edward chuckled softly. "You know more than you think. You know, compassion, integrity, and kindness. Those are qualities the company needs more than anything else right now. Brooke's cheeks flushed, her eyes shimmering with emotion. If I can help make a difference, then yes, I'd be honored. A sense of calm washed over Edward, a feeling he hadn't known in years. The pieces were finally falling into place, and for once, they weren't slipping through his fingers. He looked at Jason and nodded. Let's finalize the testament. Half of the estate goes to Penelope, and the other half to Brooke's foundation. I want the company's profits to support people who need it, not just line the pockets of the wealthy. Jason smiled, his eyes reflecting admiration. I'll make it happen, Edward. Edward's body sagged with relief. His eyes fluttering closed for a moment. The room was filled with a quiet sense of resolution, as if the ghosts of the past were finally being laid to rest. As Jason left the room to prepare the paperwork, Brooke and Penelope sat on either side of Edward, the three of them wrapped in a comfortable silence. The world outside continued its relentless pace, but within these four walls, time seemed to slow, each second precious and fragile. Edward's fingers curled around Penelope's hand. I don't know how much time I have left, he whispered, but knowing you're here, it means everything. Penelope's tears spilled over, but this time, they weren't born of anger or resentment. They were tears of healing, of a bond reforged through pain and understanding. I'm here, Dad, and I'm not leaving. Edward's gaze shifted to Brooke, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you for bringing her back to me. Brooke smiled softly. You did that yourself, Edward. You just needed someone to believe in you. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. The darkness that had once seemed so absolute now had cracks of light breaking through. Penelope leaned in, her forehead resting gently against his. We'll figure this out together, she whispered. No more regrets. Edward's lips curled into a faint smile, his breath growing steadier. Together, as the night settled over the city, the storm of betrayal, guilt, and regret began to fade. In its place was something fragile but real. Hope, a chance to rewrite the final chapter, not with bitterness, but with love. The moon had risen high over New York, its pale glow filtering through the hospital window, casting a soft silver hue across the room. Edward's eyes fluttered open, the faint light making everything seem ethereal and dreamlike. His body ached with the weight of exhaustion, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. The confrontation with Patricia was over, but the echoes of her betrayal still reverberated through his thoughts. Penelope sat next to him, her head resting on her crossed arms atop the edge of his bed. Her breathing was slow and even, the faint lines of worry on her face softening in sleep. Edward smiled faintly. How many nights had he missed moments like this? Watching his daughter, feeling the unspoken connection that needed no words. He reached out a trembling hand, brushing a lock of hair from her face. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. The warmth of her presence grounded him, a reminder that not everything was lost. There was still time to make amends, time to build something meaningful out of the ashes. Brooke entered quietly, her steps muffled by the carpeted floor. She held a thermos of tea, the steam barely visible in the dim light. When she saw Edward's eyes open, she smiled softly. You're awake, she whispered, setting the thermos down on the side table. How are you feeling? Tired, Edward rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. But lighter, like a weight's been lifted. Brooke nodded, her eyes reflecting the same relief. It's amazing what facing the truth can do, he chuckled softly, though it quickly dissolved into a fit of coughing. Brooke stepped forward, instinctively placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, until the coughing subsided. Thanks, he murmured, his voice hoarse. He glanced at Penelope, who was still asleep. I don't want to wake her. Brooke smiled. She's been through a lot today. Let her rest. Edward's eyes clouded with guilt. She shouldn't have had to go through any of this. I should have protected her. I should have been better. Brooke's hand tightened gently on his arm. You're doing it now, Edward. That's what matters. He nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in his heart. Regret could chain a person forever, but he was starting to understand that it was never too late to fight for what truly mattered. A soft knock interrupted the quiet moment. Jason's head appeared around the doorframe, his expression tense but hopeful. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Edward nodded, waving him in. Jason stepped inside, clutching a stack of documents. The papers looked heavy, not just with legal jargon, but with the finality they represented. "The New Testament is ready," Jason said, his voice low. "I've ensured Patricia is completely removed from any claim. The estate and the company are secured according to your wishes." Edward's eyes flickered toward the papers. He felt the weight of a lifetime of decisions bearing down on him. His empire, his legacy, everything he had built and sacrificed for. It all came down to these few sheets of paper. Jason continued, his voice steady. "Penelope will have control of the company, but with Brooks Foundation as a key beneficiary, just as you asked, we've structured it so the company's profits will support charitable causes, especially those that help vulnerable children and families." Edward's eyes glistened. It was the kind of legacy he could finally be proud of, something that would outlast his mistakes. He turned to Penelope, who was beginning to stir, her eyes blinking open sleepily. "Dad?" she murmured, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. He smiled weakly. "Sorry to wake you, sweetheart. There's something important we need to finalize." She straightened, her gaze shifting between Jason, the stack of documents, and her father, her brows furrowed in concern. "What is it?" Edward took a deep breath. "This is the New Testament. It secures the company for you, if you want it, and it makes sure Brooks Foundation gets the support it needs. It's my way of trying to set things right." Penelope's eyes filled with emotion. She took his hand, her voice steady despite the tremor in it. "Are you sure this is what you want?" He nodded. "It's what I need to do. I spent so many years chasing the wrong things. This feels right." Jason handed Edward a pen, the weight of the moment settling over the room. Edward's fingers shook as he grasped it, but his resolve was firm. He signed the papers with deliberate strokes, each signature a silent promise to his daughter, to Brooke, and to himself. When he was done, Jason took the documents, relief evident on his face. "It's done," he said softly. "I'll file these first thing in the morning." Edward nodded, leaning back against the pillows, his chest rising and falling steadily. "Thank you, Jason." Jason smiled faintly. "You did the right thing, Edward. Rest now." He left the room quietly, closing the door behind him. The air was thick with emotion, but also with a strange sense of peace. Edward turned to Penelope and Brooke, his eyes glistening. "It's finally over," he whispered. Penelope leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "No, Dad. It's just beginning." The moonlight bathed the room in a serene glow, the city below continuing its endless rhythm. But inside these four walls, time stood still. A family, once broken, was beginning to mend. And for Edward Scott, the shadows of his past were finally beginning to unravel, leaving space for something new. Hope. The room was quiet, wrapped in the soft cocoon of night. The only sound was the gentle rhythm of Edward's breathing, each inhale and exhale a reminder that time was still slipping away. The documents had been signed, the legacy secured, yet the air felt heavy with unspoken words and lingering emotions. Penelope sat by his bedside, her hand still resting in his. The weight of the day settled in her bones, exhaustion tugging at her, but she refused to leave. Not now, not when she finally felt like she was beginning to understand the man who had once been a stranger to her. Brooke, leaning against the window, watched the scene with quiet reverence. The glow of the city lights cast a faint silhouette around her, illuminating the worry etched into her features. She knew the journey wasn't over. Not yet. Edward stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They looked clearer now, the storm of guilt and regret slowly dissipating, replaced by a fragile peace. "Penelope," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, Dad," she said softly, leaning in closer. He smiled faintly, his fingers curling around hers. "I can't tell you how much it means to me, that you're here." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I spent so many years trying to forget you," she admitted. "But the truth is, I couldn't. I wanted to hate you, but deep down, I just missed you." A tear slipped down Edward's cheek, his grip tightening. "I missed you too. Every day." She brushed the tear away gently, her own eyes glistening. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can still make something good out of what's left." He nodded, his breath shaky. "I want that more than anything." The quiet between them felt sacred, a bridge built from years of silence and pain, finally beginning to hold weight. Edward's eyes drifted to Brooke, who was watching them with a gentle smile. "Brooke," he said, his voice stronger now, "you've done more for me than I ever thought possible. You gave me a second chance when I didn't think I deserved one." She shook her head, her voice soft. "You did that yourself, Edward. I just helped you see it." He chuckled weakly, the sound brittle but genuine. "I suppose we all need someone to show us the way sometimes." Brooke's smile faltered slightly, worry clouding her eyes. "How are you feeling?" Edward closed his eyes for a moment, the exhaustion evident in his features. Tired, but lighter. He opened them again, his gaze fixed on Penelope. "Knowing you're here makes it easier." Penelope's fingers tightened around his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The hours stretched on, the night slipping further into stillness. Edward drifted in and out of sleep, his breathing slow and measured. Penelope and Brooke stayed by his side, their presence a silent comfort. Around 3 a.m, Edward's eyes opened once more. The pale light of the moon washed over his face, giving him an almost ethereal glow. He looked at Penelope, his expression serene. "There's something I need to say," he whispered. She leaned in closer. "What is it?" He swallowed, his throat dry. "I need you to promise me that you'll live your life the way you want. Don't let the company or my mistakes define you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I promise, Dad." He smiled, a look of pure relief crossing his face. "Good, that's all I want." He turned to Brooke, his gaze softening. "And you, promise me you'll keep helping people. That foundation of yours, it's going to change lives." Brooke's eyes shone with emotion. "I promise, Edward." He let out a long, slow breath, his body relaxing into the bed. "Thank you, both of you." Penelope squeezed his hand, her tears falling freely now. "We love you, Dad." A tear slipped down Edward's cheek, his smile faint but radiant. "I love you too." His eyes closed gently, his breathing slow and steady. The room was filled with a profound silence, the kind that spoke of endings and beginnings, of grief and peace intertwined. Penelope rested her forehead against his hand, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Brooke stood beside her, placing a comforting hand on her back. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in a shared moment of loss and love. When the first rays of dawn touched the edges of the horizon, the world outside continued its relentless march forward. But within the walls of Edward's room, time held still, honoring a man who had finally found redemption in the twilight of his life. Penelope took a deep breath, wiping her tears away. She looked at Brooke, determination settling into her features. "We have a lot of work to do," she said softly. Brooke nodded, her own eyes filled with resolve. "We'll make sure his legacy means something." They walked to the window together, the city waking up beneath them. A new day was beginning, and with it, a new chapter, one built on forgiveness, purpose, and hope. Edward was gone, but his love, his lessons, and his redemption lived on in them, and in that, he would never truly be lost. The first light of dawn crept through the window, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet hospital room. Penelope stood at the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The city below was beginning to stir, the hum of traffic, distant conversations, and early morning routines creating a muted symphony of life moving forward. Edward was gone. The reality of that truth sat heavily in her chest, an ache that ebbed and flowed like waves against the shore. She'd spent so many years resenting him, pushing away memories and emotions she didn't want to confront. And yet, in his final days, he'd given her something she hadn't realized she was still yearning for: closure. Brooke stood beside her, silent and steady, her presence a grounding force. The two women had shared a moment of profound loss, yet there was a sense of connection between them, like two threads woven into the same fabric. Penelope exhaled slowly, fogging up the window pane. "It feels strange," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm standing at the edge of something new, but I don't know where it leads." Brooke nodded, her eyes soft. "Endings are like that. They make room for new beginnings, even if we're not ready for them." Penelope turned to face her, a faint smile trembling on her lips. You know, I spent so long trying to avoid anything that reminded me of him, the company, his world, everything he stood for. But now, it doesn't feel like a burden anymore. It feels like a responsibility, one I want to get right. Brooke's gaze was filled with quiet encouragement. You don't have to do it alone. Your father trusted us to carry this forward together, and I'm with you. Penelope nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. I'm glad you are. Later that morning, they found themselves in Edward's office at the family law firm. The air was thick with the scent of old books and polished wood. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the heavy mahogany desk and the leather chairs that lined the room. The space was filled with memories, some painful, some tender, but all undeniably part of Edward's legacy. Jason was already there, standing by the window reviewing the finalized paperwork. He turned as they entered, his face somber yet determined. Are you ready? He asked. Penelope inhaled deeply, letting the air fill her lungs, steadying her nerves. Yes, she said, her voice clear. I am. Jason nodded, handing her the final documents. This solidifies the transfer of the company to your name. You'll have full control, with Brooks Foundation as a primary beneficiary. Just as Edward wanted, the board has been informed, and they're ready to support you. Penelope's fingers hovered over the papers, the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders, but this time, it didn't feel like a shackle. It felt like an opportunity, one to build something meaningful, something that honored her father's hard work while staying true to her own values. She picked up the pen, her hand steady, with a smooth, deliberate motion. She signed her name, the ink flowing across the paper like the beginning of a new story. As she set the pen down, a sense of calm washed over her. She looked up at Jason and Brooke, a quiet determination in her eyes. It's time to make some changes, she said. Jason smiled. Where do we start? Penelope's gaze drifted to the window, where the city stretched out before her, alive with potential. We start by making sure the company isn't just about profits. It's about people. We're going to invest in communities, support families, and give back to the people who make this city what it is. Brooke's eyes lit up. That's exactly what Edward wanted in the end. Penelope nodded. It's what we want, and it's what we're going to do. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Meetings with the board, restructuring plans, and conversations about new charitable initiatives filled Penelope's schedule. But for the first time, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt purposeful. Brooke worked alongside her, balancing her role at the foundation with helping Penelope navigate the complexities of the company. Their partnership grew stronger with each decision, their shared vision a beacon guiding them forward. One evening, after a long day, Penelope and Brooke found themselves on the rooftop of the office building. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold, pink, and purple. The city below sparkled with lights, a living, breathing organism that never truly slept. Penelope leaned against the railing, the wind teasing her hair. Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing? She asked quietly. Brooke smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. All the time. But I think as long as we're doing it with the right intentions, we're on the right path. Penelope nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. My dad spent his whole life chasing success. In the end, he realized it wasn't worth anything if he didn't have people to share it with. Brooke's voice was soft. And now, we get to build something that really matters. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past lifting slowly, like fog dissipating in the morning sun. Penelope's heart ached for her father, but it also swelled with a new sense of hope. Here's to new beginnings, she whispered. Brooke smiled, her eyes shining. To new beginnings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city lights took over, each one a tiny spark of possibility. Penelope and Brooke turned back toward the building, ready to step into whatever came next. Together, the early morning light streamed through the expansive windows of the office. Casting long beams across the polished conference table, Penelope stood at the head of the room, her palms pressed firmly against the table's surface, steadying herself. Around her, the members of the board sat in stiff silence, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of expectation and skepticism. For years, these people had respected her father, Edward Scott. not just for his business acumen, but for his relentless pursuit of success. Now, they faced his daughter, a woman who had been absent from this world for years, who had chosen art over industry, and who now held the reins of the very empire they had helped build. Penelope took a slow breath, the weight of their gazes pressing on her shoulders. She straightened and met their eyes, one by one. "I know many of you doubt my ability to lead this company," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I've spent most of my life avoiding everything this place represents. But in my father's final days, I learned something important. Legacy isn't just about buildings, contracts, and profit margins. It's about people. It's about how we impact the world and the lives of those around us." Some of the board members exchanged glances, curiosity softening the skepticism on their faces. Penelope pressed on. "This company was built on my father's vision, but that vision needs to evolve. We have the opportunity to do more than just make money. We can create something lasting, something that makes a difference." A man at the far end of the table, Mr. Thompson, cleared his throat. His gray hair and stern features gave him an air of authority. "And what exactly does that mean for the future of the company, Ms. Scott?" Penelope's eyes didn't waver. "It means shifting our priorities. We're going to invest in community programs, education initiatives, and support systems for families. A portion of our profits will go directly to Brooke Sanders's foundation to help vulnerable children and those in need." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Penelope felt her heart hammering in her chest, but she refused to back down. "This isn't about charity," she continued, her voice firm. "It's about responsibility. We've built our success on the backs of hardworking people. It's time we give something back." The room fell into silence. Penelope could feel the weight of their deliberation, the gears turning behind their eyes. Brooke, seated at Penelope's right, offered a reassuring smile. Her presence was a steadying force, a reminder that Penelope wasn't doing this alone. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And how do you plan to ensure that these changes don't jeopardize the company's profitability?" Penelope nodded, having anticipated the question. "We'll approach this strategically. Ethical business practices aren't a hindrance. They're an asset. Companies that invest in their communities build stronger, more loyal workforces. Consumers want to support businesses that care about more than just the bottom line." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This isn't just the right thing to do. It's good business." Another murmur rippled through the room, this time with less skepticism and more curiosity. Mr. Thompson exchanged a glance with a woman across the table, Mrs. Caldwell, who nodded slightly. Penelope's heart thudded painfully in the silence that followed. The air felt thick, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, Mr. Thompson spoke. "I think your father would be proud of the vision you're presenting," he said slowly. "It's a risk, but perhaps it's a risk worth taking." Relief washed over Penelope like a wave, almost buckling her knees. She nodded, her voice calm despite the surge of emotion. "Thank you. I promise. I won't let you, or my father, down." Mrs. Caldwell smiled gently. "Let's give it a chance." One by one, the other board members nodded in agreement. The tension in the room eased, replaced by a cautious sense of optimism. They didn't know if this new direction would succeed, but they were willing to trust her. For now, that was enough. After the meeting, Penelope and Brooke walked down the long hallway, the echoes of their footsteps mingling with the distant hum of office life. The weight of responsibility still pressed on Penelope's shoulders, but it felt different now, like something she was ready to carry. "I can't believe they agreed," Penelope said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. Brooke grinned. "You were brilliant in there. You showed them that you're not just Edward Scott's daughter. You're a leader in your own right." Penelope smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Brooke shook her head. "You did the hard part. I just reminded you of what you were capable of." They stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. The city bustled around them, its energy electric and relentless. Penelope tilted her face toward the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, a belief that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Brooke glanced at her, eyes shining. "So, what's next?" Penelope took a deep breath, the future stretching out before her like an open road. "Now we get to work. We build something real, Something that matters, Brooke nodded. Together, Penelope smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. Together, as they walked forward, the city's noise faded behind them. The weight of legacy was no longer a burden. It was a foundation, a chance to create a future defined not by the mistakes of the past, but by the hope of what could be, and that future had just begun. The hum of the city buzzed through the office windows, a constant reminder that life moved forward, no matter what. Penelope stood in Edward Scott's old office, her fingers brushing lightly over the polished mahogany desk. The room felt different now, the shadows of the past replaced by the possibilities of the future. A framed photo caught her eye, a picture of her as a little girl, perched on her father's shoulders, both of them laughing under a summer sun. It felt like a lifetime ago. She picked up the frame, her thumb gliding over the glass. "You found that." Brooke's voice came softly from the doorway. She stepped inside, a cup of coffee in each hand. "I noticed it the other day. He kept it in the drawer, but I thought it deserved to be out." Penelope smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I didn't think he held on to things like this." "Sometimes people surprise us," Brooke said, offering her one of the coffees. Penelope took it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her fingers. She let out a slow breath, the weight of the last few days pressing on her. "It's strange being here. I always thought stepping into his world would feel suffocating, but it doesn't. It feels like I'm reclaiming something." Brooke nodded, a knowing smile on her lips. "You're not just stepping into his world, you're making it your own." Penelope turned toward the window, the city sprawling out before her, alive with purpose and possibility. "I just hope I can live up to what he saw in me at the end." Brooke's voice was gentle but firm. "You already have." The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds as Penelope sat in the conference room, papers spread out before her, the outlines of new projects, community investments, and ethical business initiatives filled the pages. It was a plan for a company that didn't just chase profit, but purpose. Jason entered, a small smile on his face. "You've been busy." Penelope glanced up, returning the smile. "There's a lot to do, but it feels good, like we're building something meaningful." Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Your father would be proud. He didn't always get things right, but he wanted to, and in the end, he did." Penelope's heart clenched. "I wish he'd had more time." Jason sat across from her, his eyes kind. "He made the most of what he had left, and he gave you the chance to do the same." She nodded, blinking away tears. "I'm not going to waste it." Jason's smile grew. "I don't think you will." That evening, Penelope found herself standing in front of the Scott family home. The grand facade loomed before her, a monument to a life that had once felt so distant. She hadn't set foot here in years, memories of bitter arguments and slammed doors still haunting the halls. But something had changed. The ghosts of resentment had faded, replaced by the flicker of reconciliation. Brooke stood beside her, offering silent support. "Are you ready for this?" Penelope took a deep breath. "Yeah, I think I am." They stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and aged books filling the air. The house was eerily quiet, the absence of Edward a palpable void, but it didn't feel cold. Not anymore. Penelope wandered through the rooms, each one holding fragments of a life she was only just beginning to understand. The study was exactly as she remembered. Dark leather chairs, shelves lined with business books and framed awards. But now, she saw more than just the symbols of her father's ambition. She saw his struggles, his regrets, and his final attempts to make things right. Brooke picked up a small notebook from the desk, flipping it open. Her eyes widened slightly. "Penelope, look at this." She handed the notebook to Penelope, who scanned the pages. It was filled with entries, each one a reflection of Edward's thoughts in his final weeks. There were regrets, apologies, and hopes for a future he knew he wouldn't see. "I hope she knows I love her, that I always did, even when I couldn't show it." Penelope's breath caught, tears welling in her eyes. She traced the words with her fingertips, her father's handwriting a testament to the love he had struggled to express. "I think he was trying to find his way back to you," Brooke said softly. Penelope nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "And maybe I was trying to find my way back to him." She closed the notebook gently, a sense of peace settling over her. The anger, the resentment, the years of distance. They were still there, but they no longer defined her relationship with her father. They were pieces of a larger story, one that was still being written. That night, Penelope and Brooke sat in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. The warmth of the flames cast a golden glow across the room, chasing away the shadows. "To new beginnings," Penelope said, raising her glass of wine. Brooke smiled, clinking her glass gently against Penelope's. "To redemption." They sipped in silence, the weight of the past finally giving way to the lightness of possibility. Penelope stared into the flames, her heart full. Her father was gone, but his love, his lessons, and his hope lived on within her. She was ready to carry the torch, not just for him, but for herself, and for everyone who would benefit from the changes she was determined to make. The future was uncertain. But for the first time, that didn't scare her. It inspired her. And as the flames danced, Penelope felt a quiet certainty settle within her. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning air was crisp and clear, the sky an endless stretch of pale blue. Penelope stood at the entrance of the newly renovated Scott Community Center, her heart beating with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The building, once a forgotten warehouse owned by her father's company, had been transformed into a hub for families, children, and those seeking a better future. A large banner fluttered in the breeze. Grand opening of the Edward Scott Community Center. People gathered around, chatting and laughing, their faces filled with hope. The center buzzed with activity, volunteers organizing supplies, children's laughter echoing from the playground, and community leaders shaking hands, excited to be part of something bigger than themselves. Brooke stood by Penelope's side, a wide smile on her face. She looked around at the crowd, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she said softly. "He would have loved this." Penelope took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the scene. "We did it. This was as much your vision as mine." Brooke shook her head. "It started with you. You took the weight of your father's legacy and turned it into something beautiful." Penelope's chest tightened with emotion. The ache of loss was still there, a subtle presence that she knew would never completely disappear, but it no longer consumed her. Her father's mistakes and his redemption were woven into the very fabric of this place, a constant reminder that healing was always possible. Jason approached, a folder tucked under his arm. He smiled warmly. "Everything's in place. The center's funding is secure, and the company's new direction is already making waves. People are taking notice." Penelope smiled. "Good. Let them. This is just the beginning." Jason nodded. "Your father would be proud." Penelope's eyes glistened. "I hope so." A hush fell over the crowd as the microphone crackled to life. Penelope stepped forward, her palms slightly damp, her heart pounding. She took a moment to gather herself, the faces of the community looking back at her with anticipation and trust. She cleared her throat, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you all for being here today. This center represents more than just a new building. It represents a new commitment to each other, to our community, and to the values that truly matter." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the crowd. "My father, Edward Scott, spent his life building a company that stood for ambition and success. But in the end, he realized that the most important legacy isn't wealth or power. It's how we care for one another." Her voice softened. "This center is dedicated to that legacy, a place where families can find support, where children can dream, and where no one is left behind. We're here to build a future where success isn't just measured by profits, but by the lives we touch." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound washing over her like a wave. Penelope felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't brush it away. This was her moment, a culmination of pain, growth, and purpose. Brooke squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did amazing." Penelope smiled, the warmth of Brooke's words settling deep in her heart. "It feels right." The ribbon was stretched across the entrance, its bright red color vibrant against the white facade. Penelope took the oversized scissors handed to her, the weight of them surprisingly light. She glanced up at the sky, a whisper of a prayer in her heart. "This is for you, Dad." With a swift, decisive motion, she cut the ribbon. The crowd cheered. The sound filled with joy and hope. The doors swung open, and children rushed inside, their laughter ringing out like bells. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting everything in hues of gold and amber. Penelope and Brooke sat on a bench outside the center. The day had been a success, but the real work was just beginning. Penelope leaned back, watching the last families leave, their faces bright with possibility. "It feels like a new chapter," she murmured. Brooke nodded. "It is, and this time, you get to write it your way." Penelope smiled, the weight of her father's legacy no longer a burden, but a foundation. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for everything, even the hard parts." Brooke's eyes softened. "The hard parts are what brought us here." They sat in companionable silence, the warmth of the day slowly giving way to the coolness of evening. Penelope closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze on her face, the sounds of the city, a gentle hum in the background. When she opened them, she felt lighter, freer than she had in years. The path ahead was uncertain, but she no longer feared it. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing she wasn't alone. "We're going to make a difference," she said softly. Brooke nodded, one step at a time. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Penelope felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. Her father's story had ended, but hers was just beginning, and for the first time, she knew exactly where she was going. Together, they stood up, walking side by side into the night, ready to embrace the future.